This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. We begin this week's programming with our cattle market update, where we are joined by Iowa State University livestock economist Lee Schulz. Lee shares insight on how to understand the short-term versus the long-term markets, the biological constraints of cattle with current numbers, and the USDA's cattle contracts library pilot program. Also ahead, K-State beef veterinarian A.J. Tarpoff joins us to preview KSU's 2023 Cattlemen's Day, which is taking place on March 3rd. We also share a special edition of Kansas Profile, where Ron Wilson, the director of the Huck Boyd National Institute for Rural Development, highlights how AgrAbility helped Bret Fitzpatrick continue working on the family farm after a terrible car accident. We end with this week's wildlife segment, where K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts shares information on managing prairie dogs. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are joined now by Lee Schulz out of Iowa State University, where he serves as a livestock economist, and he's joining us for this week's cattle market. So before we get into things, Lee, thanks so much for joining us.
Glad to be back with you.
Glad to have you. And starting off with a recent article that you wrote about the cattle inventory report that was released in January, you kind of talked about the big three when it comes to understanding cattle markets.
Yeah, this really kind of struck me when I started thinking about the cattle inventory and the numbers that we really focus in on. It's really three of them. And so when we looked at the longer term inventories, what's important to us there is understanding what that calf crop is for the prior year, the beef cow numbers that we have, and then the heifers for beef cow replacement is going to give us these longer term beef supplies and really the trajectory of that beef production. When we're really looking at month to month, those are the cattle on feed reports, and those are the cattle on feed, the placements, and the marketing numbers. This is the time of the year, as we got that January report, that allowed us to look at, longer term inventory numbers.
Absolutely. And with those longer-term inventories being released and us kind of realizing where we stand, the importance of biological constraints in the cattle industry is kind of important to understand right now with our current numbers, right?
Yeah, and that's what I really tried to get across in this article. When we look at, again, one of the big three, that calf crop, that was down annually as we looked about 2%. It was down 1.6% the first half of 2022. It was down 3.2%. The second half gave us a down 2% overall. But realizing that's going to give us smaller feeder cattle, smaller fed cattle numbers those fed cattle numbers won't be impacting the market until late 2023 and into 2024. Now, when you think about a replacement female that we're choosing out of that calf crop, that's going to be a long time before she can actually produce us a marketable calf. And so if you kind of work through that biology of when we're going to wean her in the fall, we're going to breed her this summer, and then she's going to produce a calf the next spring, and then you get into weaning her calf in the fall. I mean, we're looking at impacting beef production from her marketable calves as you get into 2025. And so that just shows you, even if we would start to expand, which we're not, you're going to face lower production for some time. And so that's why, I think us economists, when we like to talk about how the markets are being impacted by the supplies, it's really important to talk about the biology of the cattle industry, that it's multi-years. You pair that to looking at the pork industry, it's about a year, right? And you look at the poultry industry, and it's a matter of months sometimes before we can impact that production.
Yeah, those differences, a lot of people, I feel like, forget when it comes to markets and sustaining those, especially when it comes to cattle. It's just a long-term investment, like you mentioned. So with that in mind, I know we're thinking long-term here, but we're also thinking kind of hindsight-wise with a recent report that was released, and it was the 2022's year-end export data report. So what did those numbers really show?
Well, it'll remind us, really, when the data, when we get it, is out of date, right? We're here in mid-February. We're just getting the December data now, and that's just how it works in compiling that data. But realizing it is important to understand where we ended 2022 to put that into perspective and what that may mean for 2023. Luckily for beef exports, it was a record year. We looked at volume was up about 2%. year-to-date 2022 compared to 2021, value was up 10%. That shows you how strong demand was, right? We exported more and they paid us more for it. So that's why we've seen support of prices because of that export demand, what was so strong. You know, when I look across the individual countries, we've seen annual records from South Korea, China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Philippines, Singapore, Colombia, Guatemala, Dominican Republic. So, you know, it wasn't just one country that was really strong last year. It was really across the board, and a lot of those customary markets, but also markets we've seen growing over the last several years.
What do you think was the major contributor for 2022 specifically in terms of demand for U.S. beef?
Well, you know, I think you got to look at that somewhat country by country. You know, as you look at China, and in particular, just their growing demand for protein. Also, I think recovery from COVID and their economy has maybe been a bit better than expected. And so that's helped provide, more opportunities for exports. You also have to look at, if you look at the global situation of protein production and beef production in particular, some of those customary major export markets are down in production, right? So that has provided some opportunities for U.S. beef to find a home in some of those markets. And I also like to remind folks that our currency is not working in our favor, right? And so when you think about our exports are more expensive worldwide just because of the value of our dollar. And so that makes it more expensive for our customers, but also it makes it more expensive for our competitors. So it makes them a little bit more competitive in the world market. So also, I'll highlight that makes it show that we've seen that much stronger demand because we had that as a real headwind to us, those currency markets, and we're still able to, see the export levels that we did.
Absolutely. Success despite even some challenges that we were facing economics-wise this past year. And coming into where we're going to end with today's show, I know the USDA has been piloting this new program. It's the Cattle Contracts Library. So tell us a bit about this, why it was started, and where it currently stands.
Sure. And, so this has been something, as you mentioned, that's been an evolving process. Really, at the base, it's about calls for more transparency in the marketplace and an understanding, especially when we look at some of those formula sales, what are those formula sales consisted of? And so this was a Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2022 directed USDA's Agricultural Marketing Service to create the Cattle Contracts Library pilot program. And I want to highlight that it is a pilot program. It is something that, as I listened to the most recent webinar that was released on February 8th, I encourage listeners to go check that out. It was really informative for me. I took a laundry list of notes. They noted that the pilot program, the funding is set to expire in September 2023. So at that point, they're going to have to add additional funding or make this something that is not necessarily a pilot program anymore and something that would be permanent. Now, they've released the first two weekly reports now from the Cattle Contract Library. And, I want to highlight at this point, it's not an interactive dashboard. That's something that was talked about, and there were some questions on the most recent webinar. Right now, it's similar to what you'd see in a USDA report. It's a PDF that provides the data, but it's nothing that individual user can go in there and maybe look at different weeks or specifically different fields that they do want to pull. It is published every Monday late afternoon, so it'd be the prior week's trade would be published on that late Monday. It's going to ensure confidentiality, so there's some nuances in there. Things like you won't see percentages add up to 100% because to do that, they want to ensure confidentiality, so they have some of those. They're going to sometimes report like a simple average, a 25 and 75 percentile. Again, so we're not reporting any individual contract. It's really looking at some of those averages. One thing that I think's forthcoming that we're all interested in is they haven't reported the volume data yet. So volume data will be the volume that packers have sold relative to the total contracts, past as well as what they anticipate going forward. So we haven't had a full month of data being compiled yet. Once they do that, the past looking data will break it down by how the base price was discovered. So, I think this adds to the suite of data that's being provided by AMS, and that helps us understand these markets a little bit more. Now, I will say that we're a couple weeks into this, so before we're able to fully understand what's being provided and how that's adding to our understanding of the markets, we're going to need several weeks and probably months to kind of fully grasp this and understand that. USDA highlighted that too. They're learning as they're going, right? Because it is a pilot program. So I think we'll inevitably see some changes to the report, how they're providing the data going forward. But, we're starting that process now. And so I encourage, listeners to go check that out. You can just Google the Cattle Contracts Library pilot program on USDA and you'll find it. All the available information's on one page. They make it very easy to view and start to go look at some of those reports.
Absolutely. So just another resource to look into if producers are interested. But you did mention that September is kind of that deadline to see whether or not this program will continue, right? So time crunch here.
Yeah, I think it's been really a push to get it. I think, the first listening session I remember was back in April, and they said they were going to really, push to get this pilot program out and available. So, everyone had this information to view. But again, it is a pilot program. And so, I think as you look at, how things evolve over the next year, I think will be very important. But I think right now we need to take advantage of that information that's available and share with what you're using this for, because I think that's important. USDA wants it to be something that people are using, right? And so if that's the case, they need to know that.
Absolutely. Well, I'm sure we'll discuss it in our next chat that we have with you, the next cattle market we have you on for. So stay tuned for more information on that program, folks. I'm sure we'll be sharing more on the USDA's Cattle Contracts Library pilot program. But Lee, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Once again, everyone, that was Lee Schulz. He is a Iowa State livestock economist joining us for this week's Cattle Market Update. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are joined now by K-State beef veterinarian AJ Tarpoff for a discussion on the upcoming Cattlemen's Day. So AJ, before we get into that, thanks for joining us.
Oh, pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. Busy season for you, but March 3rd, this is a big event you're looking forward to.
Yeah, this is the big day. This is where we get our stakeholders, our producers to come to Kansas, come to Weber Hall, interact with our faculty, but also interact with neighbors and industry folks. We have a big trade show. This is our big outreach event that brings people here to Kansas to get you updated on critical pieces that can impact your operation.
Absolutely. And in a year like this one and following up on last year's, there's lots to discuss.
There's never a lack of topics to be able to cover, and we've got a really interesting headliner this year, and a topic that has been floating around, and there's a lot of misperceptions and unknown in this area, but the topic of carbon credits. In order to understand what these are, we have to get down to the basics on what they are, how they function, and what the status is here in the United States, because elsewhere around the world, they're quite different. So we have an excellent speaker, Dr. Jason Sawyer from the East Foundation down in Texas. He's their chief science officer and works with the King Ranch Institute there in Kingsville as well. So we're bringing him up. He's going to give us an overview, the ins and outs, what it is, where we are today with carbon markets in agriculture.
Great. Well, good discussion that'll take place there. And I know that lunch is always a big appeal for this event as well, right?
Oh, yeah. So, obviously the morning sessions, we begin with an excellent trade show down in Weber Arena, followed by the keynote speaker and some introductions, from our department. And then the always welcomed and, always, great information coming from Dr. Glenn Tonzer from Ag Econ. And there's plenty to talk about in cattle markets, but also beef demand. So that'll be a really interesting piece. But then lunch. That's the big driver here for Cattlemen's Day is we're beef producers, and we're going to have an excellent beef lunch. We will have brisket sandwiches available, sponsored by U.S. Premium Beef. Without U.S. Premium Beef support for the last uncounted years, they're really critical with their support to be able to host and have Cattlemen's Day. So we're very thankful for them. Now, there's more than that. If brisket lunch wasn't enough, we will also have Call Hall ice cream cups down in the arena floor so you can eat ice cream, go visit with some industry folks. Should be a really fun lunch.
Yeah, absolutely. A great start to that day's programming then. And then I know following that, there's going to be some great breakout sessions as well.
There are. This is a full day event. Starts at 8 o'clock in the morning. The afternoon sessions, this is whatever impacts you most. This is where you get to make some choices. We'll have 3 different breakout rooms with 2 sessions apiece. In one of those rooms, we'll cover a little bit on reproduction and nutrition. Okay, we're coming in out of a drought scenario. What does that mean for keeping body condition score on cows? What does that mean for reproduction coming into the spring? Followed by actually one of our new members to the department talking a little bit about environmental concerns and within the sustainability realm. He comes from a very practical sense, and Logan Thompson will cover a fantastic topic to be able to get down to the basics. The other sessions, we've got a representative coming from NBAF. I mean, the huge National Agribiodefense Lab that is right next to campus. There's a lot of questions from producers. Where are they at? What are they doing? Where they are within the process. So we're going to get an update for those of you that have questions. We'll have representatives from NBAF to be able to be there as well. After that session, we'll actually talk a little bit more on social media. I know social media is a big part of almost everybody's lives, but some practical tips on being proactive. Let's talk about our beef cattle industry and respond to any concerns from our clients that buy beef products from us. So that'll be a really fun conversation with Scarlett Haggins from Kansas Livestock Association. Now, the last 2 in Meat Lab area, we'll talk a little bit about some of the meat sensory information and compiled data from several different studies that have been done through our meats group. So that'll be a really nice overview, followed by another most popular topic, weather. We'll have Chip Redmond from the Kansas Mesonet talk about some outlook, talk about some tools, what the Mesonet is, how you can use it within this growing season and on your animal grazing season. So some excellent topics, excellent speakers, excellent company. We'll get to chat with us, with your neighbors, with industry. We welcome everybody to come to Weber Hall on March 3rd. It's coming up just in a couple weeks. Registration can be found online on ksubeef.org. The upcoming events, you can click on Cattlemen's Day. You can see information from years past, but really get on there, register. We really want to welcome you to campus.
Absolutely. A star-studded lineup for sure, and a day worth of events that you're not going to want to miss out on. I will be in attendance as well, hopefully, so looking forward to that. But AJ, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Once again, everyone, that was K-State beef veterinarian AJ Tarpoff previewing our upcoming 2023 Cattlemen's Day on March 3rd. Now that we've heard from AJ, we're going to continue on in this segment with a feature of Kansas Profile. Ron Wilson, the director of the Huck Boyd National Institute for Rural Development, highlights how AgrAbility helped Bret Fitzpatrick continue working on the family farm even after a terrible car accident.
This is Kansas Profile. I'm Ron Wilson, director of the Huck Boyd National Institute for Rural Development at Kansas State University. September 18, 2004. Bret Fitzpatrick was driving to a farm sale when his truck tire blew out on a 2-lane bridge. His truck lost control, went into the ditch, hit a power pole, rolled 3 times, and ended up in the water. When Bret came to, he was in the water and could no longer move his legs. That was the beginning of a long, tough journey for this young man who has found ways to adjust to his challenging life in rural Kansas. It's today's Kansas Profile. Bret Fitzpatrick grew up near Sterling, where his family had a diversified crop and livestock operation. Bret majored in animal sciences and business at K-State. One summer, he got an internship with a meat processing company in Hutchinson and found he enjoyed meat science and food science work. After graduation, he was hired as a food scientist in the Research and Development Department. That company is now part of Tyson Foods. Bret met and married his wife, who is from Buhler. He worked for Tyson and helped his dad on the farm. Then the accident occurred. The truck cab was crushed directly behind where Bret had been sitting, and there were power lines down in the ditch. When he regained consciousness, he was outside the truck and spitting out water. I could have been crushed, I could have drowned, I could have been electrocuted, but none of that happened, he said. A transformer had blown, so the electric lines were not live. Bret was flown to Wichita for surgery, followed by extensive rehab in Nebraska. He is considered a T11 paraplegic with a pinched spinal cord. I've tried to not let it limit me more than necessary, Bret said. He returned to work and even works on the farm with his wife and daughter. In 2009, he was transferred to Tyson corporate headquarters in Arkansas. In 2016, he and his family moved back to the family farm in Kansas where his dad lives. Bret continues to work remotely for Tyson and takes care of the cattle. The family maintains a Charolais cow herd and sells purebred bulls. One day, Bret was reading a farm magazine, and he came across an article about the Kansas AgrAbility project at K-State. "Oh man, I need that," Bret said. AgrAbility is a program to assist farmers who are injured or disabled but want to continue in production agriculture. Bret contacted the AgrAbility specialists. They got him in touch with various resources such as the Kansas Vocational Rehabilitation Program, Farm Rescue, and Rise Again. AgrAbility's motto is Cultivating Accessible Agriculture. AgrAbility does not provide direct financial assistance, but can help people find assistive devices to help with farm work, for example. "I have an electric four-wheel drive wheelchair and a side-by-side and skid steer that I use a lot," Bret said. He has installed remote-controlled gates, seat lifts for his trucks, and other assistive technology. "It's a whole world of difference," Bret said. Remarkably, he continues to travel, hunt, and work cattle. "I can run cattle through the chute by myself," Bret said. He actively hunts turkey, pheasant, and deer. There have been plenty of frustrations. Insurance, for example, would only pay for a manual wheelchair, which is totally impractical on the farm. Out-of-pocket costs for adaptive devices are very expensive. "I try to find as many ways as I can to do things independently," Bret said. He's a remarkable person, living near the rural community of Sterling, population 2,248 people. Now that's rural. "Working with AgrAbility has been a very, very positive thing," Bret said. "Bret is a great example of how a positive attitude and creativity can make a real difference," said Tawny Lawson, AgrAbility consultant. The AgrAbility team that assisted Bret worked hard to find him resources and make sure they worked for him. AgrAbility is here to keep people just like Bret working and enjoying their rural lifestyle through production agriculture, she said. For more information, see www.agrability.ksu.edu. We commend Bret Fitzpatrick for meeting these challenges and for sharing his inspirational story with others. Maybe this story can help someone else along the way. For the Huck Boyd National Institute for Rural Development, this is Ron Wilson with Kansas Profile.
Once again, everyone, that was Ron Wilson, the director of the Huck Boyd National Institute for Rural Development, with a special edition of Kansas Profile, highlighting how AgrAbility helped Bret Fitzpatrick continue working on his family farm after a terrible car accident. We're cutting to a short break now, but when we return, we'll be ending today's show with our wildlife segment for the week with K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts. This week, Drew is sharing information on managing prairie dogs and how they compete really with our cattle. If you're listening to us on the radio and are afraid you're going to miss out on our next segment because you're reaching your destination or have something else that you're having to switch to quickly here, don't forget that Agriculture Today programming is also available as a podcast. Our podcast is easily accessible on all podcasting platforms, including our website, agtoday.net, as well as Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more. You can simply search us on any podcasting platform, Agriculture Today, Kansas State, and we are more than likely to pop up, and you can follow us there. Once again, you can easily access that on agtoday.net or any podcasting platform by simply searching Agriculture Today, Kansas State. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are ending today's show with this week's wildlife segment. And joining us for that this week is K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts. So we're going to be talking about prairie dogs today, right?
Yeah, we are. Prairie dogs are one of those species that we don't think about in a lot of years, but then some years we do. And we'll talk about some of the reasons as we go along why they become important during some years.
Where do we really expect to see them in Kansas?
In Kansas, and really their broad geographic range is going to be sort of from the Flint Hills west. They're going to be in mixed grass and short grass prairies. Their range has declined quite a bit in Kansas, and that's due to several different reasons. Historically, they were associated with the areas that were grazed by bison. The bison would keep the rangelands cropped off, and that allowed prairie dogs to be further east historically than they are now.
Absolutely. So urbanization, the taking over of some of that land has led to some of these population declines?
Yeah, and the recent population declines are probably more associated with control efforts than they necessarily are with some of the landscape changes, except if we think about the same things that affect lesser prairie chickens like cultivation for agriculture. That's definitely reduced their occupied range by a large amount.
So you mentioned cattle grazing. Those environments are good for them, but there's some competition that goes on there, right?
Yeah, and I guess there's a couple of things to talk about. One of those things is what their diet is. So prairie dogs are herbivores. Their diet overlaps substantially with cattle, anywhere from 60 to upper 80s in terms of percent of the species that would overlap with cattle diets and prairie dog diets. And then the forage removal is sort of the other thing to think about. So there's clear competition with cattle. The best study that has estimated what that might cost a producer is from eastern Colorado. It was a long-term study that included drought years, average rainfall years, and wet years. And they estimated that on average, you're going to see about a 32-pound decline in gain on stalkers during a grazing season with up to 60% occupancy by prairie dogs in a pasture.
So it makes sense why cattle producers would not be appreciative of prairie dogs in their area.
It does. And like we were talking about before, there's some years where it's more important. In a wet year, you're not going to see the loss in gains like that necessarily. But in a dry year like we're having right now in this drought, there's significant competition for forage.
And that's also leading prairie dogs to kind of expand the land that they're covering too, right?
It does. As they eat the resources that are available on their town, then they start to expand. And we can see up to 50% expansion in the size of a prairie dog colony per year, and that's more exaggerated during drought times than it is in other times.
Sure. So when we think about treating for prairie dogs in our areas, what do we have in our toolbox for that?
There are several different methods. By and large, the most effective means for controlling prairie dogs is going to be poisoning. And there's two methods of poisoning prairie dogs. One of them would be to use a toxicant, which is something that an animal ingests, and the other method would be a fumigant. And the fumigant is something that it's going to breathe in. So there are three main rodenticides that are labeled for prairie dog control in Kansas: chlorofascinone, which is under the trade name Rosol, diafacinone, which is under the trade name Caput D, and zinc phosphide, which is under the trade name ZP Ag Oats. These are all going to be a treated oat bait.
Both of those kind of have carry-on effects to be knowledgeable about as well, right?
They can, yeah. So the risks to be concerned about or aware of with the ZP oats, the zinc phosphide oats, they're incredibly toxic to most things that ingest them. So a bird could potentially get a lethal dose off of a prairie dog mound, and any animal that eats those oats could definitely get sick and could potentially die. The first-generation anticoagulants are applied down inside the burrow, so they're going to be less available to birds and those sorts of things. They're much less toxic to birds, so a quail-sized animal would have to eat its body weight in those oats to die. And then there are some secondary risks of those first-generation anticoagulants to be a little bit concerned about, too. So any scavenging mammal could potentially die if it ate a prairie dog that had succumbed to the anticoagulant. And that is why, those risks are why these are restricted use pesticides, so you have to be an applicator to use them.
With the fumigants that you mentioned being an option here, is there anything special considerations-wise to know about those?
There is. Fumigants are going to be a poisonous gas that's down in that prairie dog burrow, and they kill basically anything in the burrow. They can even kill insects. And because of that, in addition to needing to be a applicator, a pesticide applicator, you also would need to apply for a prairie dog control permit. That permit, the application is accessed through your local extension office. You would fill that permit out, and then that permit would come to me. I would evaluate some things like how close are you to a black-footed ferret reintroduction site, for example, and if I approve it, then it goes to Wildlife and Parks for their approval. And that's an annual permit. So anybody who is wanting to use the fumigant that is commonly referred to as phostoxin needs to be applying for that permit every year to be able to legally use that fumigant.
And I know, Drew, that you have an article available through K-State with more information on prairie dog management.
So the Prairie Dog Management Guide that my predecessor, Charlie Lee, put together is available on the wildlife.k-state.edu website, and it does a really good job of describing the biology of prairie dogs, their benefits, also the competition with cattle, and discussing the methods that are used for control.
Wonderful. Well, thanks so much, Drew, for joining us today for this conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Once again, everyone, that was K-State Wildlife Specialist Drew Ricketts joining us for a conversation on prairie dog management. We'll be back with more tomorrow on Agriculture Today.